Okay. Okay. So the third candidate will be with us shortly, but today we have, or right now we have, Alejandra Sinquillén and Julia Mejia. So we will give the candidates 7 minutes to introduce themselves, and then we will start peppering them with questions. So do we want to start? Do we just want to start over there and then work our way this way, because this chair is empty right now?
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for organizing.
Oh, do you guys want this?
Yeah.
We could move out of the way.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't expecting a podium.
You can have the podium.
Okay.
Either way.
My communications. I'll start here and then. Okay. So thank you so much. Thank you so much to the organizers and to Julia and Ricardo for being here. It's like Alex said, it's a super exciting time, an opportunity to really diversify the City Council. I'm excited to have a few minutes to introduce myself to those who don't know me, and maybe introduce parts of my story to those who do know me but don't know me as well. So many of you might know me through my work at OISTE or at the Office for Immigrant Advancement, or working at the state legislature. But a big part of who I am is really where I came from, and the people that I have loved and the people that I have lost. I was born and raised in Mission Hill, Mission Hill, and super tight-knit community. We didn't have a lot in terms of resources necessarily, but what we had was invaluable. We had a community who turned to one another, who held one another in times of crisis, who celebrated with one another in times of triumph, and it was really a special community and a special place to grow up. I am the father of an immigrant from Venezuela. My mother is from New Hampshire, and it was just the four of us, my parents and my little sister in Mission Hill. And you know, being the daughter of an immigrant, I could see firsthand really what he had to go through when he first got here, having very little, having to learn English, but really accessing all the resources that were available to him, and Mission Hill being a huge part of that for him and my mother. And my father was an amazing person. He was someone who was a servant at heart, and what he saw when he saw other people, he saw their potential. And this was a lesson that I carried with me throughout my whole life. My father passed away when I was 13 years old, but what he taught me has stayed with me through my life as an advocate, as an educator, and then as a director of immigrant advancement. And my mother had two young girls that she was raising on her own, single mom in Mission Hill, but it was a place where she could have an affordable apartment in a safe neighborhood, access to resources so that her daughters could really grow into and reach their full potential. And so I think, you know, one thing that we can certainly say that while we're all running is that those neighborhoods are becoming fewer and fewer, and Mission Hill is not the Mission Hill that it once was, and doesn't have the affordability that it once did. So I was very lucky to be able to really, my career in service started young. I was a teacher in New York City and here in Boston at the McKinley schools. I've been an advocate, a state advocate, and then most recently as the director of immigrant advancement for the city of Boston. And you know, all of these experiences, both personal and professional, have really led to my excitement about joining the Boston City Council. And I'm just going to talk about, you know, one thing in particular. We were asked to talk about, you know, what we hope to accomplish. And one of the things that I was working on at the end of my tenure at the city was this school to deportation pipeline, and the fact that we have students who, because of what they wear, who they associate with, are mistakenly being placed on gang databases. And for and that's a terrible situation for anybody. For a non-citizen immigrant, particularly those who are unaccompanied minors, that is the difference between a pathway to citizenship and deportation and harm. And I think that, you know, one thing that excites me about the city council is that there's so many touch points in that young person's life that we have a direct impact on that can make that path different. One other personal story that I have is, it really has impacted who I am and why I want to run for city council, is the loss of my sister. My sister was murdered when she was just shy of her 25th birthday. I was 29 years old, and it was through a random act of violence in New York City, and it really obviously impacted me in a very personal way. And the trauma that I experienced at that point, but also was an opportunity where I met people across the city who were experiencing similar trauma, people that I never would have met. And so being in community with survivors, and that's what we call ourselves survivors of homicide. And we call ourselves survivors because when you suffer through something like that, you have to survive. It's like the basics of surviving. Like, okay, did I eat today? Did I go to the bathroom? Did I shower? You know, what are the things that I need to do to keep moving forward? And for me, as I think about the loss of my sister and the loss of that potential, I look at the person, the perpetrator, who killed my sister, and I think, what are all the touch points that were never met in his life, right? And where were the places that perhaps he could have gone in a different way, where he could have gone a different path? And the city council is an amazing place because we are able to touch each of those points. We're able to touch them, whether it be the Boston Police or the Boston Public Schools, at our Boston Centers for Youth and Families, our resources. There are just so many places that the city of Boston, in so many ways that policymakers, and we have former and current city councilors here today that will tell you, serving in that council and being another voice for the people of Boston. And so I'm launching this campaign. I'm launching because I think we all have the opportunity to have those touch points with people across the city, regardless of where they're from. So I'm excited to launch my campaign. We're setting our policy agenda. I don't know how grilled I'll be on policy just yet, but I'm learning from these forums, and we're going across the city and building community that way and learning from people, because really at the end of the day, the people who need to set the policy are the people who are really most impacted by the issues that are affecting our city. So I invite you to be a part of my campaign, and I thank you for taking the time to listen to me.
For those of you in the back, there's some seats. There's 2 up here and sprinkling in there, so please feel free. You don't have to stand up for the whole time. On behalf of the entire group that I'm not going to name, we just want to say how excited we are with the turnout, with all the array of people we have here from all walks of life, and especially for those of us that are we're young at heart, but we've been around the block a couple of times. I just want to say for the youth, we're so excited that you're here because it's about you. I have a 9-year-old. It's about her. So thank you. So we are going to move on. So 7 minutes, and we will let you know when it's 1 minute. So Julia, if you want to lead us on.
Buenas noches. Así mimitos. Don't worry, you don't need a translator. I speak English too. So my name is Julia Mejia, and I am originally from the Dominican Republic. I came here to this country when I was 5 years old, and I had to learn how to speak English watching Sesame Street. Right? You guys remember Sesame Street? My mother was undocumented. She was a single mom. She came to this country in hopes of an American dream, like most of us do, and realized that it was quick to be a nightmare, because oftentimes, especially when you're undocumented, you always have to worry about where you're going to get your food from, where you're going to get a job. And so at a very early age, I had to learn how to navigate systems that were never really intended for us to succeed. So I became the official translator, not just for my mother, but for everybody else's mother around the way, who was too embarrassed to go to the welfare office to seek services, who were too intimidated by the Social Security office, and who were nervous about whether or not they were going to get their food stamps. So my job was, at the age of 9, to translate for my mom and everybody else's. And at that point, I learned what it was like to be humiliated because of being poor. So because I have this award-winning personality, which you'll get to know a little bit about, on the campaign trail, I had to utilize my personality to get people to really understand that at the end of the day, no matter how poor we were, that we were human. And no matter how bad it was, we needed them to live up to their reality. So that was me at age 9, right? So imagine that. I became the first person in my family to graduate high school and go to college. I also became the first person in my family to purchase a home, and I got my mother out of Section 8, okay? So let me just take a few steps back. Oh yeah, I'm too close. She's like, I'm too close. Let me take a few steps back, literally. So I don't bust your eardrums here. Just to take a few steps back, as the first person in my family to graduate high school, the only reason why I was able to achieve that task, I was almost approaching 20 by the time I got out. And that was because Liz Walker, and I don't know if you don't know her, you should. She's the first African-American anchor in the state of Massachusetts. She went to my high school to share her story of what life was like for her to be an African-American woman in the news industry. And I was so moved by her story that I decided to go to college. At the time, I was selling shoes, making more money than my mom cleaned offices, and I cleaned offices with my mom too. But I decided that I'm gonna go to college because you know what? If she can do it, so can I. Now, there are a lot of young people here today who are living the same realities that I do, that I have experienced myself, right? So for me, this conversation in terms of representation, it's not just about race, it's about class. And that's something that we don't talk about. And that's something that I hope to bring to this conversation, because I know there are a lot of people right now who are juggling to make every single end meet. And so for me, the work that I do has always been about informing and creating spaces for those who are most impacted to not just have a seat at the table, but to sit there and inform policymakers of what are the things that we need as communities of color that are struggling to make our ends meet. I'll give you an example. In 2015, I launched an initiative called the Determined Divas, and yes, we were divas, right? We're it was a volunteer-led initiative through the Family Independence Initiative. And I was tired of elected officials coming around my way, knocking to get our vote, and then you don't see them anymore. So what we did is we created this initiative to make sure that not only are we holding elected officials accountable, but what we did is we registered people to vote, we helped them understand the importance of their vote, and then we held elected official dialogues so that we created space for those who are most impacted to not only, again, sit at the table, but to co-design and recognize that they work for us. Okay, and this is one of the things that I want to do when I get into city council office, is that I want to be accountable to the things that I say I'm going to do, because I'm tired of other people doing that and not living up to their full potential. The other thing that I'm very proud of doing is I launched an initiative in 2016. I don't know if for those who are from Massachusetts, you know that in 2016 there was a battle between district and charters, and there was this big hoopla going on, and there was this whole initiative to pit black and brown people against each other, and we were not having the right conversation. So C-PLAN, which is the Collaborative Parent Leadership Action Network, brought parents from district, charter, parochial, and MECO schools to have one conversation and to hold all systems accountable, because we knew as parents of color, no matter where our kids were, there was work to do, right? So we organized ourselves, okay? Now, in this initiative that we've launched, we're focusing on dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline, because we know that our kids are getting caught up in spaces that they don't need to be in, right? We know that our English language learners are not being well educated so that they can move on to college, right? Or career, because it's not all about college. I want to keep it real on that front too. And we also know that our students who have special needs are being put in subset classrooms and not being provided the support services that they need. So for me, entering this race is because it's about time that we have people who not only represent, but have lived these experiences and are able to work with others to inform policies. And I think no matter where you're from Grove Hall to Faneuil Hall, from Back Bay to South Bay, from Mission Hill to Beacon Hill, at the end of the day, it takes all of us to make a difference. And I believe the way that I work is as a collaborator. I'm a community organizer, and an activist, and I believe what this city council needs is a little bit of fuego, okay? And then pueblo, and that's what I'm about to do and that's the reason why I'm running, and I have 1 minute left, and I can't believe I said all of that. But no, I'm really excited to be here. For me, this is not about me. The way I lead is really about my lived experience and creating opportunities for people to step up, and also stepping to the side and recognizing that this conversation is so much bigger than us, and we can't continue to talk and talk and talk and talk and nothing gets done. So we can do all that we want on the outside, but if we don't have people on the inside prepared to do the work, it's just talk, and I'm ready to do the work because I've done it all my life. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Julia. And I now want to invite Ricardo Arroyo to share with us for 7 minutes. And I'll tell you. And I'll tell you when you're 1 minute down.
So my name is Ricardo Arroyo. I'm running for the Boston City Council District 5 seat. That's Rosendale, Mattapan, Hyde Park. And just to be clear, so District 5 is Rosendale, Mattapan, Hyde Park. I was born in Hyde Park, and I've been blessed with 2 parents who really cared about community responsibility and working social justice issues, frankly, for my whole life. My mom was a Boston Public Schools teacher. My father advocated for us on the school committee at the city council level, and now as the Suffolk County Register of Probate. Growing up in that home was unique. The reason it was unique is because when I was coming of age in Boston Public Schools, and I was about 6 or 7 when my father was on the school committee, and my after school was actually going to these school committee meetings and watching them advocate over policy. At the time, art programs were on the chopping block. There were all these different things that they were deciding whether or not Boston Public Schools were going to be allowed to essentially have, which my kids like me were going to be able to have. And so I had this different perspective growing up where I got to see where these arguments were made, but then I got to go live in a school where we did or did not receive those resources. And so it always gave me this double consciousness that we weren't reflected in these rooms, these arguments weren't being made by us. And so I had that going on in my life. And so when I was in high school, I made the decision to mentor youth through coaching. When I was doing that work, frankly, I've never really enjoyed anything more than that. And we had some really tough stories. I had 14-year-olds who had dropped out of high school, literally as a freshman. We had 5th graders and 4th graders who weren't going to classes because they didn't speak the language. And one of my earliest things I remember that I was blessed to do was Fight Against the Uns initiative, which essentially was a racist policy that was essentially the argument for it was racist rhetoric. And so I recognized that a lot of my children were suffering from institutions that were built to fail them. That essentially they were not always capable of giving voice to what was happening to them, but you better believe they knew what was happening to them, right? And so at that time, I made a decision to be a public defender. I felt like the mass incarceration of Black and brown bodies, the war on poverty, the war on mentally ill, folks dealing with mental illnesses, the folks struggling with addiction, that felt very pressing to me, very urgent. I had children who were having their own run-ins with law enforcement. We lost kids to street violence. And so for me, that felt like a very urgent fight that I wanted to be on the front lines for as soon as possible. And so I decided to be a public defender. I went to law school, I came back, and I was able to do that. I was able to work as a public defender for the Committee for Public Counsel Services. I've done that for the last 4 years. I'll give you a short story about representation. I was working in Lawrence for 2 years. I was doing the commute to Lawrence, Massachusetts, because I'm bilingual, and they didn't have many bilingual attorneys out there. And I remember my first day I was walking around the courtroom, just getting familiar with it, and a court officer, this older Latina woman, came up and just hugged me out of nowhere and said, you know, it's so great to see one of us on this side of it. And so I understood representation, but I also understood that what she was looking for was for me to fight for those folks, not to bask in the fact that I was in that room, in that role. And so I took that role very seriously. Throughout the time that I was there, I was able to help folks prevent deportation. Folks who were picked up by ICE, I was able to help connect them with immigration resources. Folks who needed mental health treatment, I was able to advocate for them to receive that treatment and not to receive incarceration. People who were struggling with substance abuse and addiction issues, I was able to advocate for them to receive treatment. And what I realized in doing this work was that it was very impactful on a one-on-one level. At no time did I ever drop below 40, 50 cases. But every day, there were new cases. When I was finished working with somebody, when we could find them a treatment center, it always felt like that's not enough. I'm sending them back into a situation where the institutions are set up to fail them. They're set up to be essentially frozen out. It was incredibly difficult, even for somebody who's an attorney, to navigate finding them treatment centers. The minute that they were no longer my client, I worried for them. And I found out through doing that work that there were other ways that I believe we could stem these things. Essentially, it felt like the folks call public defense the emergency room of law, right? Because everything's a crisis, and there's something special about being able to work with somebody in partnership when they're facing a crisis. But what I realized was it wasn't solving these crises. And so I knew that in order to deal with that, in order to affect these higher issues, the educational opportunities that they weren't afforded, the income inequality, their housing instability, I had to step out of that role into a role that allowed me to address all of these things. The city council is somewhat uniquely situated where you can have housing policy, you can do educational policy, you can fight for more funding for our schools, while you also fight to prevent neighborhood displacement and gentrification. And so I'm running to do that. I'm running to be a voice where we lift up other voices, not where I am the voice. I'm seeking ways in which we can actually create partnerships with the community to elevate their issues, to make sure that they're seen and heard when we're in city council chambers. When I talk about what I'd like to do as a district councilor, I understand that it's constituent services. I understand that there's justice in the equitable distribution of city resources, and that for a long time our folks weren't receiving that equitable distribution. I understand that. But I also see neighborhood displacement and education as a constituent issue. If your children aren't receiving the education they're entitled to, that's a constituent issue. If you can't live in the community that you were born in, if you can't afford your rent because you're paying over 50% of your paycheck to your rent, that's a constituent issue. And so when I go there, when I make it to the city council, my goal is to advocate for these issues, to advocate not just for the constituent services on a street level, but also on a vision and policy level that helps create stronger foundations and access to opportunity that currently we're not able to tap into at the rate that we should. And part of that, I got a minute. So part of that, just really quickly, and I hope to be able to go into more of that, is calling things what they are. And so when I was working as a public defender, I recognized that I was fighting an institution that was institutionally racist and that was bent on essentially destroying and doing harm to my community. And so when I did that, I took that knowledge every day, but naming it took away its power. And so for me, as I see policies that lead to, as the Globe covered, underfunding of our public schools, when I see policies that lead to neighborhood displacement, that lead to folks being considered affordable housing if they pay up to 50% of their paycheck for rent, I see those as fights for equity, I see those as fights for justice, and I see that as a fight that I'm happy to carry on, and that I want to carry on for that district, for Mattapan, Hyde Park, and Rosendale, on the City Council.